Hello and good afternoon or good evening or good morning or good whatever time of night or day it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. This is Liviana coming to you with another installment of Republic News. As is often the case, this installment of Republic News will be another opinion editorial, or perhaps something akin to a course, as it's going to be a long installment, which will likely be divided into several parts. In this installment of Republic News, I will be discussing a bit of history and the history of thought and how it relates to certain current social phenomena. This is, as I said, going to be a long show, and as such I may decide to divide it into several videos when it comes time to upload. I will be talking about matters going all the way back to the ancient Near East and moving through the early medieval period, the Reformation, the Renaissance or Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the colonial era, the rise of existentialism, and right on up to the present day. I will ask you to be patient, as the relevance will become rather apparent when I get close to the end of this discussion, if not before. And I suspect many of you will be surprised at the historical roots and connections of certain contemporary social phenomena. Recently, I was having some discussions with several different people on various social media platforms about what might appear at first glance to be three different topics. After the last of these discussions had gone on for some time, I realized that all three topics were very much interrelated and that the connections should be made plain and explained, but that such an endeavor would require a somewhat lengthy elaboration to go back into history and show how some of these things have come to be, their roots and their historical context, and that hints to the connections would need to be taken from more recent history before diving back into the distant past. Before undertaking such an endeavor, however, it is meet and proper to invoke the aid of divinity, according to some, and so therefore I appeal unto Clio, the Greek muse of history, whom the Romans called Clio. Clio, bright telling one, thou who recountest the truth of the past, guide my mind and my tongue, that I may offer a faithful and beneficial historical examination in this discussion. So I ask of thee, and so may thou grant my petition. Genoito. H.L. Mencken was, among other things, an American journalist in the first half or so of the 20th century. He was at times curmudgeonly, cantankerous, and prone to satirical and occasionally cynical comments. Not a perfect person by any means, still some of what he had to say has value. I will not be discussing him personally further in this installment of Republic News, and especially will not be pointing out his flaws, because his personality and his flaws are not germane to what I intend to discuss, and to focus upon his character in an attempt to dismiss what he said would be essentially an ad hominem fallacy. I will, however, be quoting him a few times, as well as a number of other people, and I will refer to his own situation in life, that is to say, where he lived and where he was from. So the first quote from H.L. Mencken, which I would like to share with you, is this somewhat satirical definition he gave of Puritanism. He wrote, "Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy." Now, Puritanism was originally a reform movement within the Church of England and regarded by the Anglican establishment as essentially a type of heresy. Puritans were persecuted and eventually left England and ended up in the so-called New World. The Puritans were heavily influenced by the thought of John Calvin. Indeed, Puritanism is a specific manifestation of Calvinistic doctrine and practices based thereon. I will be returning to the subject of Calvinism and discussing it in some detail, but before I get to that, I would like to share another quote from Mencken, and that is this. "If there is one mental vice, indeed, which sets off the American people from all other folks who walk the earth, it is that of assuming that every human act must be either right or wrong, and that 99% of them are wrong. Now, at this point, it is where I would like to refer to Mencken's Sitz im Leben, or situation in life. Namely, Mencken lived in New England, which is where the Puritans settled when they first arrived in North America, and their influence lingers still rather strongly in the region of New England. What Mencken has described here sounds much more like Puritans in particular than Americans in general. However, the tendrils of Puritan thought are deep in the American psyche, even outside New England, where such influence has traditionally been strongest. This very strong undercurrent of Puritan influence in New England affects perspective toward others as well as toward oneself. I will explain what I mean in more detail when I come to discuss Calvinism later in this installment of Republic News, and some of Nietzsche's ideas still later. A few days ago, a verified Twitter account called BBC This Week tweeted out a quote from Monroe Bergdorf, a former model for L'Oreal. She said, quote, "The uncomfortable truth is that the white race is the most violent and oppressive force of nature on earth," end quote. Someone else on Twitter retweeted this with the comment, quote, "On the left, this isn't even some weirdo fringe belief anymore. It's one of their most central, sacred, animating dogmas," end quote. And this retweet was retweeted again by yet another person with the comment, quote, "This is actually true, and it's incredibly disturbing. It permeates the whole left now. It's like a weird racist mind virus," end quote. I saw this second retweet and replied, "No, it doesn't." And I meant it doesn't permeate the whole left. And I continued, "It's time to start distinguishing between actual progressives and the limousine liberals who have rebranded themselves or attempted to do so by co-opting that label. Progressives are not outrage mongers, which some call SJWs," end quote. I should have also added that the conflation of liberal and progressive with left is based on one-dimensional thinking about which I have spoken at length in articles in the Progressive Flame and in other videos here on this channel. But briefly, I'm pointing out that left, center, and right are terms pertaining to economic perspectives, while radical, progressive, liberal, limousine liberal, moderate, conservative, ultra-conservative, and reactionary are terms which, as I'm using them here, pertain to social attitudes. More than that, however, there is yet another axis which pertains to one's preferences for law and order at one end or liberty and chaos at the other end. This axis is sometimes spoken of in terms of authoritarianism versus libertarianism, where libertarianism refers to a belief in civil liberties and is not a reference to the so-called Libertarian Party. It is not only on the social axis, but also on this third axis, where we have to make distinctions in viewpoint, for limousine liberals tend to be authoritarian, whereas progressives and the older type of social liberal tend to be libertarian. And again, as I stated in my response to the second retweet, some limousine liberals, namely establishment Democrats and their followers, have been trying to rebrand themselves ever since the Democratic Party lost the presidential election of 1988, by which time the Republicans had so smeared the term liberal that it was widely regarded as a pejorative in American society at the time and could be used as an insult. The Republicans were able to have significant success in this effort to smear the term due to the unwillingness of the Democrats to defend the label. That unwillingness, or as I have sometimes called it, spinelessness, does not entitle the Democrats and the limousine liberals to co-opt the designation progressive in their efforts to rebrand, all the more so since progressives and liberals have at times had rather epic battles, one of the most recent of which was during the Vietnam War era, when liberals were largely more or less in favor of the war effort, while progressives were mostly opposed. The establishment Democrats are liberals at best, or limousine liberals. Some are even moderate, and there are still a few conservative Democrats as well. A limousine liberal generally means well, but due to certain tendencies to condescending and patronizing attitudes, the limousine liberal assumes a sort of ivory tower approach to issues and seeks to impose what they believe to be solutions from the top down. This should make the authoritarian character of their perspective rather obvious. A progressive, however, works to find grassroots solutions and take them upwards, which should suggest a more libertarian character to their perspective. Some limousine liberals are so out of touch with the ordinary people that they have no real grasp of what life is like for such people. They do not understand the challenges faced by the poor and the working class, and have a rather skewed perspective on what poverty and struggling to make ends meet actually mean. If exposed to the realities of the people and their everyday lives, they are shocked, but generally rather quickly allow doublethink to take over and cleanse their minds of this jarring divide between the rich and everyone else. They may even be hypocritical in their solutions, suggesting, for example, that the working class should pay more in taxes and that the social safety net needs to be reformed by cutting programs whilst giving tax breaks to the rich like themselves. They may not relate to how others have to be concerned for their own safety, and thus propose what they believe will be solutions to issues which do not even address the symptoms, let alone the causes, trying to take away the people's right to self-defense and the tools needed for such, while they themselves sit safely and comfortably in gated communities with private security guards. They may imagine themselves as breaking glass ceilings for women while collaborating with brutal dictatorships which trample on the human rights of women, all the while accusing anyone who dares to question them or disagree with any part of their perspective as sexists and chauvinists and misogynists. They may, while in government offices, exploit unpaid prison labor of black inmates while condemning their critics as racist. They may find their disagreement with the people hilarious, even when such disagreement be their own opposition to equal rights for others. And when popular opinion becomes too great to ignore, if they wish to achieve their ambitions, they may change their public statements, claiming to have evolved on the issue, while privately continuing to profit from those who oppress the very people they claim to now support, and having the gall to accuse those who challenge them of being homophobic. These people are not progressive, and what's more, they are not leftists. A leftist would not be cozy with Wall Street and big banks. A leftist would not encourage corporations to move their factories out of the country and turn them into sweatshops in order to maximize corporate profits, as Bill Clinton did by promoting NAFTA. A leftist would not be sponsored for political office by big banks and corporate interests, nor by hedge funds. A leftist would not embrace regressive, pro-corporatist policies, nor bail out the very bankers who defrauded untold numbers of Americans and very nearly tainted the economy. A leftist would not sell out the people's health care in exchange for contributions from Big Pharma. A leftist would not promote a law which would give a tremendous boost to private for-profit insurance companies and give hefty fines to people who cannot afford to buy it. The Democratic Party establishment is neoliberal, not leftist. Now, neoliberalism is not some new kind of social liberalism. It is instead a resurrection of the economic aspects of classical liberalism, and as such, and in their most excessive, in their most excessive manifestations, as were the dominant policies of Presidents Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. It is therefore a far-right economic perspective. It is anti-labor, it is pro-corporation, it is anti-regulation, and so on. It's time to stop calling the Democrats the left. They're not the left, nor are they even part of the left. Anyway, this was a slight digression from the historical discussion I would like to do here. My boyfriend tells me that I go off on tangents too much in my videos, but this digression is a part of my script and not me wandering off script. But now let me get back to the main topic here, and as I continue, you'll see how this digression, or at least most of it, fits into the bigger picture of this discussion. The point of this digression was to demonstrate that it's neither fair nor accurate to tar all of the left with the same brush, and that it's especially unfair to tar the left with the brush properly applied to people who are nowhere near the left. But this is, as I stated, a digression from the main topic, however relevant to that topic it may prove to be when this discussion has finished. There is certainly a group of ideologues who have embraced their own flavor of racism, unable or unwilling to recognize their own racism as racism, while accusing everyone else of being racist. And they are therefore engaging in a cycle of abuse, a sort of cycle of abuse writ large, as they project the abusive behavior born of their self-defined victim mentality onto anyone and everyone else, expanding damaged personality disorder from what would ordinarily be a small social circle onto society as a whole by means of social media and political activism and so forth. And it doesn't stop with racism, but indeed extends to false accusations of sexism and homophobia and transphobia and so on. Now, these are certainly actual prejudices. They do exist. There is such a thing as bigotry. There is such a thing as racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia. Those things are real. They do exist. But false accusations are another matter entirely. This fact is very relevant to the main topic of this discussion. Indeed, it is the central phenomenon I will be discussing, but in a wider historical context. These are people who have engaged in what I call semantic revisionism, which is to say, redefining words in a way which promotes their views in defiance of the way such words have been used in the past. This is not leftism, nor is it, in the terminology of certain conspiracy theorists, cultural Marxism, because there is no such thing as cultural Marxism, and this so-called culture war of which they speak is actually not a war over culture, but a battle of ideologies. In large measure, this semantic revisionism has been not a part of nor a product of leftism, but instead one of the rhetorical tactics of postmodernism, which encourages a hyper-relativistic approach to epistemology, discourages a belief in anything remotely like objective truth, and attempts to misrepresent history, logic, and even science as somehow evil, as the products of whiteness and maleness and cis-heteronormativity, and therefore necessarily biased, not merely in their conclusions, but in the very systems themselves, that is to say, history and logic and science themselves. Indeed, the postmodernist metaphysic regards any apparent realities as mere social constructs, regardless of any argument or evidence to the contrary. This misrepresentation erases women, LGBTI people, and non-white persons who have been experts in history, logic, and science. But this, as we shall see, is also a common symptom of these outrage mongers, ignoring what is inconvenient for their narrative, or even blatantly denying it, and is therefore an example of confirmation bias. As you might expect, when a person is willing to dismiss the entirety of history and logic, that person can come up with all sorts of nonsensical dogmas which are never examined critically nor allowed to be subjected to any sort of criticism, and thus postmodernism can be regarded as a species of fundamentalism. Indeed, part of the semantic revisionism of these people is something I have discussed before. The redefinition of terms like political correctness and racism and sexism and so on, such that anyone who disagrees with even a little bit, or anyone who offers constructive criticism, or even anyone who dares to ask sincere questions, is essentially automatically derided as sexist and racist and homophobic and transphobic and white supremacist and alt-right and so on. Their self-referential incoherence and hypocrisy do not end there, however. I use the term hyperrelativism to describe their epistemological perspective in order to draw attention to their claim to embrace what would be excessive subjectivity to the point of a solipsistic metaphysic and a wholly antinomian ethic, denying that there is any such thing as right or wrong, and yet this is mere lip service. For in practice, the postmodernist regards anything outside himself or herself as in error, or at the very least as indistinguishable from error. At the same time, however, while advocating for this sort of hyper-relativistic and absolute subjectivity, they also tend to accept certain personalities as authorities, and for all their pretense of being unique individual snowflakes, wind up with a rather specific shared ideology based on authoritarianism, self-righteousness, an absolute unquestionable dogma, often in defiance of anything consistent with the laws of logic, historical facts, or scientific evidence. They are, to some extent, similar to the classical foundationalists of the early 20th century with their verifiability criterion. In this case, the self-referentially incoherent verifiability criterion has been replaced with an assertion that, quote, everything is relative and subjective except this statement, end quote, which should be rather obviously inconsistent or self-contradictory or the like. Now, let's go back in time and look at some of the historical precedents and roots of postmodernism and its outrage mongers. I have already touched upon Puritanism, and the similarities should be obvious. The self-righteousness, the condemnation of any and all who are judged by the acting subject as somehow evil or in error, whether they be considered heretics or racists and homophobes and sexists and misogynists and chauvinists and transphobes and whatever. The dour and humorless character of those espousing both of these ideologies. But Puritanism is, as I have noted, a manifestation of Calvinism, and therefore I would like to talk with you about Calvinism at this point. Unfortunately, it has now been almost 25 minutes, or well, it's about 23 minutes in, and that is rather long enough for the first part of this installment of Republic News, or this course, if you will, in a historical context of postmodernism and its outrage warriors. As such, I am going to beam up to my V11 Stormbird and warp out. And until next time, this is Liviana, and I bid you all have fun, but stay safe. And again, if you have enjoyed what you have heard and seen here in this video, please click the like button and consider subscribing. And if you like what I do here in general on my YouTube channel or at my publication on Medium, The Progressive Flame, then please consider becoming a Patreon. A patron at Patreon, sorry. And also, I've added a link in the video description now to my Discord, which I have set up for my YouTube channel, for my subscribers and any patrons that I may eventually have. So if you would like to join my Discord server, live streams and bids, or something like that. If you would like to join, then please, by all means, click the link and come hang out with us. It is a moderated and private Discord server, and so therefore you will have to be vetted a bit if I don't know you before we let you into the inner sanctum, so to speak. Because, you know, there is a lot of raiding and a lot of trolling and so forth and so on, which has occurred on Discord in the past. And I do have a few rules and guidelines which I expect to be observed if you're going to be part of my Discord. I also have a super moderator and a moderator who are there to make certain that my my wishes in this matter are respected. And so at any rate, yes, please click the like button if you liked what you have heard here and seen here today in this video. Think about subscribing. I'd certainly appreciate it. You could be notified of new videos thereby. And if you really like what I do, please consider becoming my patron at Patreon. The link is in the video description. And if you really like what I do and maybe you want to take a chance on getting on a live stream, I do at some point in time, then consider joining my Discord. And at this point, once again, let me say have fun, but stay safe. This is Liviana signing off.